Today's subject is a man whose smile once sold out theaters, whose athletic grace stunned early Hollywood, and whose name became synonymous with bold, uncompromising stardom. Burt Lancaster. He was the acrobat turned actor who leapt from circus tents to sound stages, the Oscar winner who could command a scene with nothing but a look, and the producer who dared to make films the studios wouldn't touch. But behind the headlines, the roaring crowds, and the flawless performances, Burt Lancaster's life carried shadows few ever saw. He raised children in the middle of his meteoric rise, navigating a private world of Sunday breakfasts and birthday calls, while juggling a reputation as one of the most powerful leading men of his generation. Marriages cracked under the weight of fame, friendships burned out in silence, and personal losses chipped away at the man behind the legend. To audiences, he was the swashbuckler, the general, the preacher, the prince. To his family, he was a complicated father trying to steady himself between scripts and sleepless nights. He wasn't perfect. Hearts were broken. Distances grew. But those who knew him remember the way his pride softened whenever he spoke of his children. Long after the Klieg lights faded and the awards gathered dust, Burt Lancaster was remembered not only for redefining the Hollywood hero, but for the private, unpolished battles that shaped him as a man. This is the story of Burt Lancaster and the triumphs and heartbreaks that followed his family far beyond the silver screen. He was born in the late 1940s, just as Burt Lancaster's name began appearing in bold type across Hollywood columns. And from his earliest memories, James Lancaster felt both pride and pressure in equal measure. In the early 1950s, his mornings often began with the hum of studio calls in the background, while his father prepared for another day on set, a stack of scripts on the kitchen table, and newspapers filled with rumors of on-set arguments or late-night affairs. At school, teachers praised him, but classmates whispered, asking if those magazine stories about Burt were real, and even as a boy, he learned to smile and stay quiet. Family dinners were rare, interrupted by premieres or press interviews, yet James watched his father light up a room with effortless charm. That same charm cast a long shadow over the household, teaching James early that living under a famous name meant every misstep or rumor would follow you, even before you were old enough to choose your own path. By the late 1960s, as Burt Lancaster dominated awards season and interviews, James quietly enrolled in film school, determined to find his own voice in an industry that already knew his last name. Stepping onto sets as a production assistant in the early 1970s, he carried reels and fetched coffee while whispers circled that he only got the job because of his father's influence. Producers would shake his hand warmly, then ask sly questions about Burt's rumored feuds with directors, forcing James to master polite deflections. When he pitched his first short film, some executives listened with genuine interest while others looked past him, expecting the charisma of Burt, but finding a young man still carving his own identity. He endured moments when headlines about his father's personal life, divorces, lawsuits, behind-the-scenes conflicts would erupt, and colleagues would watch to see if James would speak out. He never did. Instead, he doubled his hours, learning camera work and editing, refusing to trade family drama for easy credibility. Each project in those years felt like a test, each introduction an echo of the man who raised him. And through it all, James kept moving forward, building a foundation that was his alone, even as the Lancaster name hung over every door he opened. By the 1980s, James Lancaster had outgrown the role of eager apprentice, stepping into associate producer credits on modest films that began to earn critical notice. Yet the shadow of Burt Lancaster still lingered in every meeting and interview. Trade magazines often introduced him as Burt's son before mentioning his own work, and panel hosts still tossed questions about his father's fiery temper on classic sets, hoping for anecdotes that James refused to offer. Behind the scenes, he became known for his discipline, arriving before dawn to scout locations, staying late to resolve budget snags, and quietly mentoring younger crew members who had no idea of his family's history. At industry gatherings, he'd smile when older actors approached, reminiscing about Burt's brilliance and scandals alike. And though the words sometimes stung, James would nod with measured pride. In private, he admitted that watching his father face both applause and condemnation taught him to value steadiness over spectacle. By the end of the decade, his projects stood on their own merit, and he'd learned to walk into a room not as an extension of Burt Lancaster, but as a man who had earned his place despite carrying a name that would forever stir both admiration and old Hollywood drama. Susan Lancaster was born in the late 1940s and spent her earliest years in a house constantly buzzing with phone calls from agents and studio executives, a place where evening news often included her father's name, followed by rumors that confused and unsettled her. By the mid-1950s, while other children played freely in quiet neighborhoods, Susan stepped out of the family car in front of schools where photographers sometimes lingered, hoping to catch Burt Lancaster with his children. She learned quickly to walk past them without looking up, though inside she wondered why her family drew so much curiosity. In the 1960s, when she entered her teens, glossy magazines often splashed stories of her father's alleged affairs or disputes with directors, and friends at school would whisper questions she didn't know how to answer. At home, she watched her father's charisma light up dinner tables on the rare nights he was there, yet sensed the tension between her parents growing heavier with each headline. The public life that brought Burt fame cast a quiet weight over Susan's private world, shaping a childhood where pride in her father's talent was always tempered by the sting of knowing the family's struggles were never entirely their own secret. As the 1970s unfolded, Susan Lancaster reached an age when many in her circle chased the limelight, but she turned away from it, choosing universities far from Los Angeles and quietly building a life outside the reach of entertainment columns. She watched from a distance as her father appeared at premieres and in televised interviews, sometimes defending himself against questions about broken marriages or clashes with producers, and each headline reminded her why she valued anonymity. When classmates or colleagues discovered who her father was, conversations often drifted to gossip, and Susan learned to smile politely before steering the topic elsewhere. She explored careers in education and nonprofit work, fields where no one cared about box office numbers or Oscar speeches, and where she could control how much of herself the world saw. Occasionally, journalists would call seeking quotes during a flare-up of old Hollywood rumors, but she rarely answered, preferring to protect both her own peace and the family's fragile privacy. By choosing a quieter path, she built a life defined not by the scandals that swirled around Burt Lancaster, but by her own decisions, proving that sometimes stepping away from the spotlight is the bravest act in a household built on fame. Through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Susan Lancaster settled into adulthood with a steady rhythm far removed from the red carpets that once defined her childhood, yet her father's presence never truly faded. On Sunday mornings, she would sometimes catch a classic film on television, From Here to Eternity or Elmer Gantry, and feel a flicker of pride knowing the man commanding the screen was the same father who once tucked her in after long days on set. But pride was always paired with distance, because even as Burt Lancaster aged into a respected elder statesman of Hollywood, reporters continued to revive old stories of divorces and behind-the-scenes feuds, stories that reopened memories she had tried to leave behind. At family gatherings, Susan spoke little about his public image, focusing instead on shared meals and quiet conversations, moments that reminded her that beyond the gossip, he was still dad, still capable of warmth despite the storms his fame had created. When colleagues at her workplace asked why she never used her last name to advance, she only said that her own path was enough, never explaining the years of watching fame both elevate and wound the people she loved. By the time Burt Lancaster passed in '94, Susan had learned to carry his legacy with careful balance, proud of his artistry, guarded against the chaos that came with it, and intent on living a life defined by her own steady choices, rather than the relentless spotlight that once shadowed her every step. Joanna Lancaster entered the world in the early 1950s, just as her father's career was hitting a new peak. And from her earliest memories, she was surrounded by the rhythm of cameras, scripts, and industry chatter that never seemed to stop. In the 1960s, while most children spent weekends at playgrounds, Joanna often found herself on studio backlots, watching Burt Lancaster step into costume or rehearse lines with directors whose names filled headlines. She listened quietly as lighting crews adjusted rigs and publicists whispered about new roles, but she also overheard the murmurs about feuds, affairs, and lawsuits that followed her father wherever he went. By the time she was in middle school, Joanna had already seen the strange split between the man who hugged her at night and the man the tabloids described in sharp, unforgiving tones. In high school during the late 1960s, she began helping with small production tasks, fascinated by the machinery of filmmaking, yet wary of the cost of fame after watching her family endure constant scrutiny. She witnessed tense phone calls when her father's private life became public again, sensed the strain in the household during award seasons, and learned early that success in Hollywood often carried scars invisible to the audience. Those formative years, lived half in the glow of studio lights and half in the shadow of relentless gossip, planted in Joanna both a love for the craft and a caution about the very industry that defined her family's name. By the late 1970s, Joanna Lancaster had quietly stepped into professional life, taking early jobs as an assistant on low-budget productions where few recognized her last name, a deliberate choice to test herself without leaning on Burt Lancaster's reputation. In the 1980s, she moved up to production coordinator and later associate producer roles, earning respect for her calm problem-solving on sets, even when crew members eventually discovered who her father was. That revelation often brought uncomfortable moments, directors asking offhand about Burt's rumored arguments with studio heads, or reporters slipping questions about old scandals into otherwise routine interviews. And Joanna learned to answer with measured grace, never feeding the narrative that had once unsettled her childhood. She focused on schedules, budgets, and creative logistics, carving out a reputation as someone who kept projects on track without ever demanding the spotlight. By the early 1990s, she had worked on several notable independent films, building connections based on her own reliability rather than inherited fame. Yet at industry events, photographers still tried to link her name to her father's legacy, and she often felt the dual weight of pride and caution as she walked red carpets as a behind-the-scenes professional. Those years proved that Joanna could thrive in the same industry that had complicated her family life, shaping a career that quietly honored Burt Lancaster's artistry while rising above the drama that had once defined their household. In the mid-1990s, after Burt Lancaster's passing, Joanna found herself invited to retrospectives and tribute events where his films were celebrated and his image was carefully polished for audiences who remembered only the charm and the accolades. She stood on stages beside veteran actors who spoke fondly of his talent, while avoiding mention of the storms that once rattled their sets, and she learned to smile through introductions that always led with her father's legendary status. In interviews, journalists often pressed her for personal memories, hoping for colorful details about on-set tempers or family disputes that had fueled Hollywood gossip decades earlier. But Joanna mastered the art of redirecting the conversation, offering thoughtful praise of his craft while refusing to revive old wounds. At charity galas and award ceremonies, she moved through crowds with quiet poise, aware that cameras still followed the Lancaster name, even though she had built her reputation off-camera. Some colleagues admired her ability to balance pride with privacy, while others he hinted she could use her lineage for greater opportunities, advice she always declined. Through these appearances, Joanna carried both the glow and the gravity of a legacy, representing her family with dignity, proving that even in a world hungry for scandal, it was possible to stand firmly as herself while honoring the complicated man who gave her his name. As the years moved into the 2000s and beyond, James, Susan, and Joanna Lancaster each settled into lives shaped but not consumed by the legacy of their father. And in quiet moments, they often reflected on what it meant to carry a name that still sparked recognition decades after Burt's last performance. For James, now an experienced hand in production circles, every new project came with the unspoken challenge of proving himself without leaning on his father's triumphs or answering for his controversies. And he often said in private that those pressures had sharpened his work ethic. Susan, long removed from the Hollywood stage, built a life defined by calm and privacy. Yet when old films aired on late-night television, she felt a complex pride, knowing the man the world revered was also the father who had missed dinners but taught her resilience. Joanna, still moving quietly through the industry's back channels, found herself mentoring younger crews, explaining that fame was not just about applause, but about responsibility, a lesson she had absorbed from both Burt's brilliance and his public struggles. Together, though rarely in the spotlight, they shared an unspoken bond forged by growing up in a house where cameras flashed and gossip swirled, and they understood that the Lancaster name would always evoke both Golden Age glamour and whispered drama. In the end, each of them carried that legacy differently, through hard work, through distance, through quiet stewardship. But all three ensured that beyond the myths and headlines, the memory of Burt Lancaster lived on in ways more personal and enduring than Hollywood ever saw. Three children. One carried the craft forward, one carried the discipline behind it, and one carried the legacy no one expected. James stepped into the industry and built his own footing. Susan stepped away from the glare and held on to the family's quiet dignity, while Joanna stayed behind the scenes, protecting the Lancaster name long after the credits rolled. Each lived a different version of what it meant to be a Lancaster, not just by birth, but by the weight of history. Their father gave the world unforgettable films. They gave him something softer, steadiness, privacy, and the truths he never had time to explain. If this story moved you and you want more deep dives into the hidden lives behind America's most iconic families, subscribe to After the Fame. Your support helps bring the untold side of fame to light. Thanks for listening.